Lebanon's Hezbollah has confirmed that two of its top commanders were killed in an Israeli airstrike on Beirut. Lebanese health officials now put the death toll for the strike at 31, including 3 children. The attack has raised regional fears of an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah, which is designated a terrorist group by many countries.
2 apartment buildings ruined in this densely populated neighborhood in Beirut. The airstrike happened during rush hour, as people were leaving work and children heading home from school. Hours later, rescue teams were still on the scene, looking for anyone still trapped under the rubble. Israel says civilians are being used as a human shield by Hezbollah leaders. And according to Israel, Commander Ibrahim Akil, one of the most wanted men on the planet, had gathered here underground with other Hezbollah operatives under a residential building.
If Hezbollah is not pushed back from our border to north of the Litani River through diplomatic efforts, Israel will be left with no choice but to use any means within our rights to defend our citizens and enable the evacuees of the north to return to their homes. And I call the parties to act now before it's too late, because we don't want to see escalation in the region. We have no intention to enter a war with Hezbollah and Lebanon, but we cannot continue the way it is.
For people in Lebanon, though, the lines between what is war and what isn't are becoming increasingly blurred.
War? I don't know if it started or not, but nothing is reassuring. It is clear that the two sides will not stop.
I'm not afraid for myself. I just want the country to get better. But it's not. The war just keeps going. I don't know where we're heading.
And the fears of not knowing where this flurry of tit-for-tat attacks is heading are rising by the day. Hours before Israel's Beirut strike, Hezbollah pounded northern Israel with dozens of rockets. And this came after the deadly explosions of Hezbollah pages and other communication devices earlier this week. Israel has neither confirmed nor denied its involvement in the blasts of the devices. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has condemned device explosions in Lebanon as violation of international law. The UN spokesperson in turn urged all parties to de-escalate immediately, saying that the region is on the brink of a catastrophe.
Joining me in the studio is DW Middle East analyst Shani Rozanes. Hello, Shani.
Hey, Eddie.
What does the latest strike on Beirut tell us about Israel's new war goals?
Well, Israel announced officially this week that bringing back the Israeli citizens who had to evict from the northern border back to their homes, this is about 60,000 Israelis, this is an official goal for this war, which was not so far, and they seem to be pushing very strong on it. It's not just because of internal pressure from Israelis who want to see some solution to the north, but it's also because there's an understanding that what's happening in Gaza, there was always the hope that a hostage deal would be the key that will bring down escalation in Gaza and also will tone down Hezbollah attacks, which is something that Nasrallah himself this week said, it's all connected. And once there's an understanding there is no solution coming for Gaza, the Israeli government realized they need to start working on a plan for the north border, the clashes with Hezbollah, and we see a very, very strong escalation in a week. Yeah,
definitely an escalation. Israel, however, says it does not want an all-out war. But based on recent events, what are the chances of, for instance, Israel invading Lebanon?
Well, we need to look very carefully at what Israel is doing. It has tried to avoid any ground operations across the border into Lebanon or any, invasion as it might end up looking like. So for Israel, that would be the last case scenario because Israel's military is stretched. Of course, still many soldiers in the southern border with Gaza. There's the West Bank. And a ground operation in Lebanon would be a very complicated mission. Israelis know it very well. Many of the commanders of the military today have spent years and years operating in the south of Lebanon, along the border where Israel has tried for many years to create a buffer zone and failed and paid in the lives of many Lebanese and, of course, many Israelis and soldiers. So Israel would try to avoid it. They're pushing back the ball into Hezbollah, into Nasrallah's hands, and hope to see where he's taking it, basically saying, we're not afraid, you're not going to be the only one setting up the rules here, but they still hope it's not going to be an all-out war.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the tit-for-tat continues. Iran is yet to retaliate for the killing of Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh. It seems something we've sort of forgotten about, but how prepared is Israel if that happened?
Well, if you asked if Israel officially, of course they are. You know, they have been preparing for a war with Iran for decades now. There seems to be an understanding that whatever it is that Iran might be doing, Israel can contain it. That at least was the assumption that they were operating under when they went along with this presumed assassination of Haniyeh, which Israel still does not officially acknowledge it. It stood behind. But then at the same time, you know, for Iran, many years Hezbollah was supposed to be the arm through which it executes any conflicts with Israel. And we might be seeing this happening any moment now.
Right. Shani, Rozanes, DW Middle East analyst. Thank you.
You're welcome, Eddie.
All right.
I'm now joined by Behnam Ben Taleblu, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights has condemned the Lebanon device blast as a violation of international law. What's your take?
Well, it's an interesting take by the UN High Commissioner because there's been relative silence from the United Nations, both personally and professionally, when you look at high-ranking UN personnel, as well as from different organs of the UN body since October 8th, which is when Lebanese Hezbollah became the first of the many Iran-backed Shia militias in the region to enter and make what we're facing in the Middle East a wider multi-front war against Israel. So with immense respect to the High Commissioner, I find that to be a somewhat politicized take, and I also see it as one that looks at the conflict through a series of snapshots rather than a story of or a video that is changing over time.
Well, it might be a politicized interpretation, but some analysts have been saying that Israel is playing Russian roulette and dramatically risk an escalation with Iran and its proxies. Do you agree?
Well, actually, I think there has been a change in Israeli national security doctrine, perhaps not officially, but philosophically since October 7, whereas when you looked at the way Israel dealt with many of these groups and even dealt with their patron, the Islamic Republic of Iran, it was more about managing the situation. Now, I think post-October 7, given issues Israel faces on many fronts now, I think it's quite keen to solve some of these problems. And militarily, Israel is indeed doubling down. It's added, for example, to its war aims by the war cabinet, the bringing back of the 60 to 80,000 internally displaced persons, which requires a measure of peace and calm and quiet on the northern border. And Israel appears united in the sense of achieving that means using the military option more frequently and with greater vigor and trying to gut as many mid to high level Hezbollah commanders as possible. So Israel is indeed engaging in some short-term escalatory steps with the hopes of restoring deterrence for a longer period of time.
Well, as you were saying there, Israel does appear to be focusing its military campaign on high-ranking Hezbollah figures, and Hezbollah has now confirmed that the death of one of their top commanders in this recent attack in Beirut. So after this week's events, how seriously would you say Hezbollah and its command structures have been weakened?
Well, not to the extent that Hamas in the south, in the Gaza Strip, has been weakened, where there's been a systematic gutting of the Hamas political and military infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip, as well as transnationally with some of the strikes that we saw in Lebanon, as well as in Iran over the past 11 months. Hezbollah is a little bit of a different story. They've had different elements of their command structure, such as one of their air defense leaders, for example, taken out. This individual, Mr. Ariel, that you mentioned, was tied to their elite ground forces, their Redouan forces. These are the people that would engage in a cross-border operation if the higher-ups ever green-lighted it. So they've gone after different elements of the command and control in Lebanese Hezbollah's infrastructure. To that extent, I don't believe politically they have crippled the organization yet.
But when it comes to both Iran and Hezbollah, they have promised some type of response to these latest attacks. What do you think are the options that they have available to them?
Very interesting, less so Iran than Hezbollah in this instance. And even as we get more perspective and distance from it, it's been about a month and a half now since the Islamic Republic promised a harsh revenge and indeed talked about, quote unquote, bloodlust in response to the killing of Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran by the Israelis in late July. Yet no official overt kinetic operation has commenced from the Iranians, at least, like we saw on April 13 and April 14. And I think the reason is the closer that we get to the one-year anniversary of the October 7 terrorist attack, the Islamic Republic is unfortunately, it's sitting pretty. It's looking back at the regional chessboard. Things are going its way. Regional normalization between the Israelis and the Saudis is delayed or at least pushed back. There's greater tension between the Arab street and the Arab states. And indeed, there's greater political tension between Arab states and Israel overtly and Arab states and even the United States of America. So while Iran's proxy network is more dependent on it and Iran is getting more great power patronage, Israel is indeed being politically isolated from some of its Western counterparts, as well as losing some of the bridges that it had built or tried to build earlier. So that may explain why the Iranians are not responding. And therefore, I fear it's more a sense of success than fear that is explaining the short-term restraint. With Hezbollah, I think it's still very much the art of the possible. They know that if they try to phase too much, they could end up losing their head. So they're quite keen to continue the tit for tat and escalate it ever so slightly to stay below some of Israel's thresholds.
All right. That was Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Hans-Jakob Schindler, Senior Director at the Counter-Extremism Project. Hello and welcome, sir. Now, in a few days, there's been pages and walkie-talkie explosions, and now last night's airstrike. How weakened is Hezbollah now?
At the moment, Hezbollah is in a really weak situation. On the one hand, it cannot trust its communication devices. It had tried to switch to different means of communications via pager to make its communication system more secure. And now that has proved extremely unreliable, even deadly. And on the other hand, it just lost again, within a space of a couple of weeks, the second in command after Nasrallah. So Aqil was promoted after his predecessor was killed by Israel. So Hezbollah is in a very, very weak state right now. But this is, of course, only temporarily. Communications systems can be replaced. Also, there will be, of course, a replacement for Aqil.
Right, right. And it's been tit for tat, between these two sides for a while now. How could Hezbollah respond to the latest attack?
Well, Hezbollah has very few options. It is very clear, even from the words of Nasrallah, who admitted that this was a heavy hit when the pagers and the walkie-talkie exploded, that Hezbollah, or neither Hezbollah nor Iran, really want to see this slide into a major regional military confrontation. That leaves Hezbollah with very few options. Clearly, the Israeli airstrikes prior to killing Aqil, which targeted rocket launchers, indicated that Israel is assuming a large rocket and drone barrage towards northern Israel, maybe even central Israel, for which Hezbollah absolutely has the capability by now. But that's pretty much the only option that Hezbollah could do. Any intrusion into Israeli territory, any larger scale terrorist attacks inside Israel always bears the risk that those within the Israeli government, and Defense Minister Gallant has been the most outspoken among those, who really think that this is now a time to deal with Hezbollah, would then finally get the go-ahead for a larger scale, possibly even land invasion into Lebanon.
While all that is going on that front, it's fair to ask where this leaves the latest escalation leaves the war in Gaza. Can Israel afford a two-front war?
Well, I mean, Israel has already transferred the 98th Division out of Gaza into the northern part of Israel. There was a decision by the war cabinet in Israel a couple of days ago that now the northern front is becoming more important. Gaza really militarily is done. Even the Israeli side had announced that it had destroyed more or less the military infrastructure of Hamas in Gaza. Now the question is, what is going to be a sustainable situation in Gaza? Who is going to administer the Gaza Strip? And how can the IDF, while moving troops out of the Gaza Strip, actually prevent Hamas from coming back? Any vacuum that the Israeli military and security forces leave behind in Gaza will, of course, mean Hamas is re-emerging. There is simply no other Palestinian faction in Gaza that can administer this territory unless the PNA is allowed to go in, or the UN, or some international troops.
Right. All sides claim that they want to prevent a wider regional war. But what's the risk of Israel getting into a wider escalation involving Iran and its proxies based on all that's going on?
This is a very tense situation right now. So this newest attempt now to really degrade Hezbollah, possibly force it to accept the UN resolution from 2006 and remove its troops behind the Litani River is, of course, an extremely high-risk endeavor. Clearly, 60,000 to 80,000 Israelis have not been able to go back to their homes since October last year in the north of Israel. This is an economic and political problem for the Israeli government. But this new escalation, any kind of move in this direction is uncontrollable at a certain point. So every side has to be very careful, not inadvertently, to actually move towards a war.
Right. Hans-Jakob Schindler from the Counter-Extremism Project. Thank you.
Thank you so much.